Well, welcome everyone. Welcome into today's webinar. We've got a great webinar and a great topic for you all. The ultimate fleet guide to building a sustainability plan. We've got two speakers that are going to lay it out for you. Ty Lehman, Senior Product Marketing Manager for VerizonConnect. Wave your hand there, Ty, and say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Ty. And Matt Stevens-Rich, he's the Director of Technical Services for Electrification Coalition.
Thanks, Chris. Good being with Rick.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ty and Matt and jump back in when we get into a discussion. Ty, go ahead, take it away.
All right, sounds good. Thanks so much, Chris. Well, I'm very excited to be able to talk to everyone today, and this is an area that I'm personally very passionate about. So I want to start off talking about a little bit about why fleets might be interested in creating a sustainability plan. So the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people when they are interested in sustainability, of course, is going to be regulations. Knowing what requirements that a company must meet to comply with a law that affects them. Now, particular focus for vehicle fleets is usually going to be on emissions, of course. And this is especially true recently because there's been an increased focus at the state and federal levels on reducing emissions, especially in commercial fleets. The reality is that existing regulations are unlikely to go away anytime soon, and new ones are starting to be passed in various areas around the country. So, for example, the California Air Resources Board is starting to ramp up its new Clean Check program, which will require most commercial heavy-duty vehicles operating in California to get emissions checks to ensure that they meet local standards. And this is true regardless of whether the vehicles are actually registered in the state of California. So commercial fleets are having to start to take proactive steps to ensure they are complying with these regulations that affect them. And so, this is just one example of the types of regulations that are being looked at across the board in many different areas of the country. So because there's always the possibility of new regulations being passed in the future, there's a level of uncertainty of what specific regulatory requirements a fleet might have to meet someday. A sustainability plan helps companies get out in front of these regulatory requirements early on. By putting a priority on sustainability, one, it helps companies meet their current regulatory requirements that they're currently subject to, but two, it puts them in a better position to meet new requirements should they arise down the line. The goal, of course, is to be positioned so that if you find yourself subject to a new regulation, you're able to meet those requirements with no or minimal impact to your day-to-day operations. Now, of course, along with the regulatory requirements, one of the main concerns for commercial fleets is, of course, the reporting requirements that goes along with regulations. Most states have some sort of requirement in place that require vehicle emissions to be tested in order for the vehicle to be registered. Now, with a sustainability plan, you're looking on how you can meet those specific reporting requirements in the most efficient manner possible. This can come in the form of creating a schedule of when you want to take your vehicles in to have the emissions checks done so you know that you're minimizing the downtime. But it also includes looking at different options and how you want to be able to meet those requirements. So, for example, some states are actually exploring the possibility right now of allowing you to use telematics data, send in telematics data so that they can know already whether your vehicle's in compliance instead of having to go in and conduct a physical emission check. So this way, vehicles don't necessarily have to be taken off the road. This is one area where different alternatives are available to comply with those emission check standards. This is also where electrification can have a significant advantage, of course, because those vehicles are not necessarily subject to the same types of emissions requirements and need for emissions checks, allowing them to stay on the road more often. Of course, a sustainability plan goes on just beyond the regulations because many companies are actually just looking to reduce their overall emission and set their own sustainability goals just to be good stewards of the environment. Now, with a sustainability plan, one thing you can do in this area is set specific measurable goals for yourself. So instead of just saying, hey, we want to be a more sustainable, environmentally friendly company, with a plan you can set in place, say, hey, we want to reduce our CO2 emissions by a specific amount. That gives you something to strive for and achieve, which can lead to a better sense of pride and accomplishment by employees once you're actually able to get there. And once again, this is an area where electrification does provide a good alternative to be able to hit those goals, because there are tools available that can help show you, if you decide to pursue that strategy, what types of the amount of CO2 emissions that you can expect by converting a vehicle to electric. There are also just pure reputational benefits associated with becoming more sustainable. And that's because many members of the public are placing an increased value on an organization's commitment to sustainability. They may be more likely to do business with a company that they think is trying to be more environmentally friendly. So with a sustainability plan, one thing you're kind of looking to do is, of course, look how you're going to be sustainable, but also how do you want to promote that? How do you want to tell the public that you are taking these efforts so you can reap some of the reputational benefits? On the flip side, this also helps you avoid some of the negative reputation that can happen by not being environmentally friendly. Even to the level of someone just driving down the road behind a vehicle that's putting out significant emissions can be very off-putting to the members of the public. And when you compound that to a larger scale for larger fleets, the negative reputation can be even greater. So trying to take all this into consideration right now and make proactive steps to becoming more sustainable can actually help you avoid some of that negative reputational downside. And then finally, to kind of the why, there are total cost of ownership benefits with becoming sustainable, especially in the long run. Now, this is true because when you're looking at total cost of ownership, you're of course looking at the vehicle cost itself, but you also want to look at the fuel costs and the maintenance costs. And over the long term, fuel costs and maintenance costs tend to be lower with things like EVs when you're taking those sustainability efforts. There's also an opportunity cost to be taken into play, because especially when you're considering maintenance, whenever your vehicle might have some issues and need to go down for maintenance, then that's going to be off the road. So that's an opportunity cost and productivity that you can help address with sustainability. So this is one of the areas when we talk about electrification that there is a significant benefit as well. So those are some of the just kind of initial things that we like to talk about. Well, why create a sustainability plan? Matt, I'd like to get some of your thoughts as well. What do you think of some good things to add in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're covering all the best bases for sure, Ty. I mean, and everyone can really appreciate how helpful planning is really across all aspects of operation. Two other things to call forth, and something we really see with fleets that we work with, which at the Electrification Coalition, we're a national nonprofit. We work both on the public and private side, and on the public side, actually working with local, state, federal governments. So we get to see a lot of different fleet operators out there, but especially to what you were helping outline. Two other things I'd really drill in deeper on is, especially with the telematics approach and a lot of that TCO consideration, which we'll drill into more as well as the presentation goes on. It really boils down to, how can I be sure, if this is my first wave of deployment, or maybe we have a couple EVs in the fleet and we are looking to scale up that deployment, how can I have confidence the routes that they're going to be running, that they're going to have the charge needed for running it, essentially getting everything done successfully, to your point, Ty, about minimal interruption to the day-to-day operation. And that's true for all fleet operators. If you're a refuse hauler, if you're just running regional logistics, everyone is always focused on time on task. So that's where having a lot of this analysis approach and planning approach, it helps you know those routes that are going to be next optimal, where are you going to be pulling the trigger for that next deployment. And also, and we'll talk through a little bit more too, as there's a lot of federal funding currently afoot too, as well as tax credit programming, it also helps you better answer those questions, because unfortunately the lead time on those grant requests, be it at the state, federal, or even utility funding, usually it's a short window you have to develop a project. So having this plan in hand, or at least knowing a general sense of where you're going, it helps you be far more quick to respond. Honestly, doing a little bit of legwork helps you be really ready to go on that planning. So especially if you're thinking about possibility of grant requests or other things to that nature, these plans really help you have a leg up and really be ready to go when that moment comes as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's all about just being ready to take those actions when you need to be able to take them. So having all that laid out to your point, when you have some things when you want to start implementing it and you have to be in a faster pace, then doing all the legwork up front can be extraordinarily beneficial. So I think it's a good thing that we've added in there. Well, I'm going to move on to, we talked a little bit about kind of why create a sustainability plan, but I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the things that should be included in the sustainability plan. So when you're developing these, there's a few key things that we think you should ask yourself. The reality is, of course, that every sustainability plan is going to be very, very specific to the individual company and their own sustainability goals. But there's overarching things that we do think will benefit almost every company when we're working in this space. The first, of course, is to go back to those regulations that I mentioned before. Really think about what other regulations that you're currently subject to, and how can you what is it you want to do in order to comply with those existing regulations more effectively. And the second is, of course, okay, how can you then reduce those burdens over time, and especially in the long run, to help you meet those sustainability goals? Now, short-term strategies, one of the most important things that you can think of to immediately reduce your vehicle emissions and comply with regulations is to place an increased emphasis on your vehicle maintenance. The reality is, well-maintained vehicles function better, use less fuel, and contribute to fewer emissions. And the reality is, modern emissions checks, they tend to be looking more actually at a vehicle systems to ensure that they are functioning properly, instead of actually measuring the particulate matter coming out of a vehicle. So vehicle maintenance is very, very important. Vehicle manufacturing has actually been heavily regulated. So if a vehicle systems are functioning correctly, most of the time it should actually meet existing emissions requirements. So as such, being proactive about that maintenance is incredibly important, and one of the best things you can do, especially right away, to help meet your sustainability goals. There are a few recommendations that we have about how to be more proactive with your vehicle maintenance. The first, of course, is just setting up a well thought out maintenance schedule, using tools to know precisely when vehicles need to come in for their routine maintenance, and that can help prevent some of those more significant issues happening down the line. A second potential is to invest in systems that can actually pull data directly from vehicles on an ongoing basis, so that they can notify you if something happens and gives you that notification so that you're able to address those issues as they arise. And a final thing is to consider implementing a policy where drivers are required to conduct periodic inspections of the vehicle and report what they find. That way they can catch issues on early. Now, for some types of vehicles, of course, these inspections are mandatory, but even if they're not, drivers are on the front lines of knowing their vehicles, and it gives them an opportunity to provide feedback on how the vehicle is functioning, and this can be highly beneficial. Now, the goal of all of these is to catch maintenance issues early on, so you don't have a big issue come up unexpectedly, or if you go into an emissions check, you don't accidentally fail it because there's an issue with the vehicle that you were unaware of. So those are so that's one of the main things, especially in the short term. But in the long term, many companies are not just necessarily looking how to make certain their current vehicles are operating properly. It's how can they reduce their total emissions that they are producing. And this is really where an electrification strategy as part of your overarching sustainability plan can come into play. For many fleets, pursuing some level of electrification can help them make significant progress in meeting their sustainability goals. So creating an electrification plan that increases the number of EVs in a fleet can help them reduce their emissions over time. And there's some secondary benefits to consider to this as well. EVs, as I mentioned before, do have lower maintenance requirements than many internal combustion engine vehicles. This also leads to decreased maintenance costs and increased uptime. And there's also the potential for fuel cost savings. At VerizonConnect, we've actually pulled lots of data to see that when you actually compare the cost of electricity to that of gas or diesel, there can actually be significant savings in your day-to-day costs for using that vehicle for its operations. So while of that, now some people are kind of daunted by the thought of this process of going into electrification, but there's actually there is examples of companies switching to alternative fuels before and has been very, very effective. Excuse me. One thing that's happened in the past is many vehicles have actually moved towards using, propane or other alternative fuels, and there's precedent out there for making the switch effectively. And in some ways, doing it with electrification, it's even easier. It just requires a well thought out plan to determine specifically what you need and where to start. And to Matt's point before, the sooner you start looking into these options, the easier it can be to achieve your goals. And so, so those are some of the initial ideas that we had for things to include in that plan. And Matt, I'd love to, have you chime in with a few more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to your last point, which I can't agree with more enough, honestly, the best part of the work, the part I really enjoy is getting to work with fleet managers across the board. Because, it's always so dedicated work, really wanting to be sure that there's success, regardless of, what the operation is. To that point, especially those tuning in that maybe have looked at or maybe indeed deployed compressed natural gas, biodiesel, propane, other, even hybrid technology. There is a lot of that same theory of change afoot here. If anything, when you start thinking about how are we going to operate our vehicles and other equipment on a non-gasoline or diesel dependent basis, it's the exact same zeitgeist that we're tapping into there. So you're exactly right. There's nothing I love better than, especially getting to work with fleet managers who have already begun that path on migrating to alternative fuels, and they're really able to just take from that lesson learned, that internal knowledge base that they've built out, and that helps them move even faster on electrification. You mentioned it too, really quick, Ty, and it's definitely exciting as more of the technology is helping, especially on the fuel cost savings. I mean, to state the obvious, the good news on electricity, it doesn't change that much in price. Put simply, the price that I pay on my residential electricity, I know it's probably going to be roughly around that it's 12 cents a kW where I live. It's probably going to be that next month and the month after. Whereas the price at the pump, I can blink and it changes in a moment, right? So that's where there's definitely some fuel cost savings there on average across the country. It's around, in terms of gasoline gallon equivalent, it's about $1.10 a gasoline gallon in terms of amount of energy for electricity. So right off the bat, to your point, Ty, there is that fuel cost savings to be had, even more on the diesel operation side, which unfortunately that can get to be even more of a penny pinching move on the price per gallon. But back to the plans, it helps you understand what's we're obviously focusing on cost savings and total cost of ownership, but this also then helps you be able to better extrapolate and forecast what is my total cost of ownership at different price points of fuel as well. And that is a really powerful element. All fleets refuel in different ways. Some deal on multi-year fueling contracts. Other pay the price at the pump at the local BP station. But these planning maneuvers, it's obviously about being sure it's a successful deployment, but it is also giving you better tool and ability to anticipate what are your fuel saving potentials and other total cost saving potentials if operating underneath different scenarios too. So fuel, as you can imagine, it is the biggest aspect to the total cost of ownership calculus. But again, back to the planning and also just bringing in these decision points is going to be it really informs the decision process to that.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, and thanks for throwing out some of the specifics on those. I do like the one thing I really like what you talked about is like that more consistency on the electricity price. At your point, that is something that is a lot on a lot of people's minds right now, is that massive fluctuations that can happen, both positive and negative in fuel. So to the extent that you have some, predictability on what you're going to have to pay, it's actually able to help you take those costs in consideration and do better planning over the long run. So including those kind of metrics in an overarching plan, I think will help people be more successful as they move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll intercept from Ty and take us through the next two slides. We're going to go a little bit more now into that data-driven decision point process. Ty did a really good job laying the table, especially understanding the why we do the work and really delving into that. So the next two slides, we're going to really focus a little bit more on the how, and also just really digging into how these solutions come together. So, to really focus in on data-driven decision making. I mean, I'm actually at a conference in Detroit right now. So a kind of joke to that, and meeting with a lot of different fleet partners is it's like, well, probably a lot of preference for General Motors, Ford, and a lot of the local home base, which is great. But it's always really important to understand a lot of those attributes to the decision point process, in the sense of being sure the equipment, the vehicles that you're getting, it's going to get the job done. It's really going to fill that need. And also we can build the hypothesis on what's the total cost of ownership, cost savings that we want to try to target, or how are we going to refuel these vehicles and recharge these vehicles, which we'll talk more on the next slide. But it all really does point to that you need data to make these decisions. Otherwise, it's an educated guess at best, or a gut, a gut impulse, which honestly isn't going to really hack it. It also helps us really understand to the point of once we're deploying, once we're in the midst of that stretch, we have metrics coming in, which also helps us inform how much of a success is this being, where are points that we need to flex or maybe change up our decision point. It can be things, for instance, on making a different vehicle selection with the next round of procurement, or maybe changing a charging schedule. But all of this really does require those data inputs. So some example of those inputs that's on this slide here, there's the internal variables, which are always going to be key elements of consideration. Vehicle class, so it's not just year, make, model, it's engine displacement and other elements to what makes that vehicle operate, and in turn how much is that going to affect vehicle range, power ability, what's the hauling capacity, some of those elements there, which leads into routes. Routes can vary wildly, as too many people know. A common example I love to use is PepsiCo, which also operates Frito-Lay. They actually are doing a lot around all alternative fuels, including electrification. But the same truck might do 2 runs in the same day, one where it's hauling cans of Pepsi, which is the soda can is a very brilliant invention, and it's very dense and it carries a lot of material. So if you're carrying that liquid, that's one of the heaviest payloads possible you can carry. And then if you're carrying bags of chips, as we all know, it's just full of air. So same routes, but very different payloads. These are elements that really can throw off that decision metric, especially being sure that we're able to safely and effectively operate and get the job done, which also affirms, to the operations and location pieces. On locations too, just to also call that out, depending on what type of route operations you're looking at, especially the refueling strategy. Some fleets do all the refueling behind the fence back at depot. Others do look to that midday charge or mid-route run, for instance, especially if you're running multiple states or that type of regional operation. So as you can imagine, with electrification, charging can come into more play, especially if you're looking at those longer ranges. And we can also talk too about charging speeds, which also adds to that as well. But definitely affirming what those locational operations look like. And then finally, to idling and fuel consumption, to Ty's earlier points around not just the cost savings of operation, but these are real metrics that can be measured. Honestly, even to if your organization has sustainability goals in mind, some have number of minutes not idling and other types of core metric, which are really helpful things we can measure and pull off of data that's being captured as these are operating. I'll also quickly affirm too, so external variables listed here. So there's incentives. I made quick mention of that, where we have tax credits afoot, both at state and federal level. There are a lot of grant funds available on charging and vehicle sides. And this is something where there are other great tools and resources that can indeed be integrated with these plans. It's a type of moment of not just thinking about how you're capturing all the telemetry coming off the vehicles, but also able to use other tools and resources, especially if that can help take a bite out of the procurement costs for these vehicles. EV specs and pricing, as you can definitely follow in the news, price points can fluctuate, especially to these different ranges and different types of model coming out. Again, a lot of great tools and resource element to that, and also something that can be accounted for within the plans. Not something obviously capturing right off the vehicle, but things for consideration in that regard. Ty, what about for especially a lot of the work that you do and how you see it, just balancing, there's a lot of data inputs to this, right? But yes, what are the biggest things that you guys try to focus on, or even with your customer base that they're most focused on in consideration?
Well, to your entire point here, we've seen that when customers take the approach of taking a more data-driven strategy, it ends up being more effective, and it gives them more information from the beginning on, kind of alleviate some of the initial concerns. So one of the main things that we see is using, some of the VerizonConnect telematics data to help you determine, hey, is a particular vehicle a good fit for electrification? To your point of like routes, so the day-to-day routes that you're using, would an EV be a good fit in this specific circumstance? And so we've seen companies using this to make some of those, especially when they're first getting into this space and saying, hey, we are interested in pursuing EVs and maybe adopting a few to start out with, which are the ones that we really should focus on, or look at specific vehicles that are actually, at their current end of life, and determining whether those specific vehicles would be a good fit for electrification as well. So using the data-driven approach and using some tools that are available that take in a lot of these metrics to give you those recommendations. Say, hey, this vehicle would be good. This vehicle, it goes beyond an EV's range most days, so maybe save that for later. Using those kind of capabilities really does help companies make those specific decisions. Because of course, the last thing you want to do is pursue down a road and find out it wouldn't work for you. So this data-driven approach is key to ensuring success when deciding to go in this space. And like I said, when we've seen companies do that, that's when they've had the most success with the process.
Yeah, and well, it's funny you mentioned absolutely right, and again, to the routes are a very even when you have the data at hand or able to map that out, it is still a very elusive concept where you might think you know exactly how those routes are being run, but it is something that we also see too when we work with a lot of fleet operators. That can really have a big X factor. It can be the difference between a successful deployment and one that's just going to have a lot of problems. And also with a very quick remediation of, yeah, let's just get that vehicle onto this ever slightly shorter route, or even thinking about some of those operational logistics. So can't agree enough. And especially for, fleets that have a very set route or very, very set runs, that's great. That really gives you a good standing. But this also allows you to then open up some of the, even just some of the strategy around how you are deploying your vehicles. For instance, a lot of fleets will put the brand new vehicle operations into the longest routes or the heaviest duty loads. And then the ones that are getting up in years, if you're still holding on to it, you're moving it back into a little bit more of the backup setup or running a shorter route. School districts, for instance, too, so school buses. But that, again, that routing, that also helps you really be sure, if possible, you want to be maximizing the runtime, especially as you're deploying alternative fuels and electrified option, because that's how you're maximizing your total cost savings and ultimately saving the most fuel possible through the operation. Well, we'll go to the next slide then, really to focus on charging. Point blank, charging is always where the rubber hits the road, pun intended, in this, even as we are considering what are the best vehicles to be deploying or what's going to be the best fit for operation. Charging is always going to be another key element there. It's the one never to sleep on. There's nothing worse than a fleet manager that makes the call saying, like, good news, I cut the purchase order, we got the EVs rolling, we're going to take delivery in 6 weeks. I got to go plan out charging, and there's nothing worse than delaying that decision process. If anything, we always recommend, let's talk charging first. That's going to be a key factor. We've mentioned and alluded to some of those charging considerations, and again, it's a very unique circumstance depending on how you operate and where you're looking to go. So, such examples are on-route public charging, especially as you look at the private charging networks or other types of charging destinations that might be co-located with your routes and the ways that you operate. Or even, to be honest, there's an electrical contractor nearby where I live. I see their van charging at an Electrify America station every lunch break around noon because there's a really good falafel joint right next to it. So I'm on to them on their charging strategy. But by having a lot of this data coming in, really taking a look at it, it lets you indeed consider, if needed, what are your on-route charging options, or even if you're having to run a very specific one-off route that's not typical, how can you be sure that you know where those chargers are? Home charging does continue to grow in popularity, more so on the light duty side, but that take home policy, or if you operate like a Salesforce fleet or something like that, where it's a more employees have a vehicle that they take with them and have at their home overnight. That is another consideration there too. There's a lot of ways to go about that. many are familiar with like Wex cards and other things, which there's a lot of familiarity on how you can do home charging or even just tracking the charging usage at the home for reimbursement later, as well as going to the first bullet, maybe using a nearby public charger too, if needed. So more and more folks are looking to that at-home charging, especially if it fits the operational elements. Facilities team and local utilities, these are your core partners as you're looking to plan out your charging. The call can never be made too early to the utility, even if it is just a, hey, heads up, we're planning on dropping in 20 more level 2 chargers. While level 2, and for those not familiar, level 2, 240 volt connection, it's basically a very common charging type found out and about in the community and within the city. Really good fit for if you're looking at a more overnight charge design, or indeed just plugging in for a couple hours. And then DC fast charging, high speed charging, really intended for quick minute top up, very popular along your major highways, interstates, anywhere that time is of the essence. We really want to maximize our charge there. But utilities and facilities teams, these are core elements here. I speak in working with a lot of fleet partners. The facilities team is often a very different team that is on a very different side of the organization or the operation. But we are starting to step into their territory. It isn't as simple as you have a fuel budget and the facilities team has the electrical bill budget, and they're two separate things. We are starting to more co-blend this. So it's really important to talk that through, really have a good strategy in place so that when that electrical bill comes through for the charging, if you're doing it at a depot, we know how to pay for it. We know whose budget that's coming from. But so too with the utilities. They have a lot of make-ready programming, and also just as they're looking to grid demand as that continues to grow, it's really helpful for them to continue to plan it in and also get you all the services and other support possible from their side to help you deploy charging as best as possible. Charging timing, so what can be called time of use rates, for instance, depending on your utility territory, and just general charging profile, which means speed of charging. Put simply, you can reduce your charge speeds, for instance, during high electrical cost periods, and then increase to full speed overnight or when electricity is cheaper, or if you're monitoring it against renewable energy generation, greener. Telemetry and vehicle telematics is a critical factor here. It's how we're going to be measuring how much charge does the vehicle need, and planning that out. Some people go with a very hard manual approach here, where you are hard coding, literally just checking boxes and typing in on the back end control scheme of the charging infrastructure to manually control that. There are better automated solutions too coming afoot, where you can also just have a more automated approach, not need to set exact timers or things like that to that. Ty, on your end, I just grazed the surface, especially on the smart charging controls. It's a rapidly expanding space and an exciting space. How do you see charging integration with customers you work with?
So in our space, the telematics space, a lot of what our customers are really interested in knowing more about, okay, how do we take that into consideration in our day-to-day operations? So, you have all the things when you're building out your initial charging infrastructure, then the main things that you were mentioning there. But then kind of once that's in place, and you're trying to, okay, live with this every day, how easy is that going to be, especially when we're kind of making the move, when we initially have a mixed fleet where we have lots of gas vehicles still, but still have some EVs, and I need to know the status of the various vehicles that I have. And so having insight into the charging status of vehicles like throughout the day has been very important to the fleet managers that we've worked with. Say, hey, I want to be able to send this vehicle out, dispatch it, but I need to know what is that individual status. And so incorporating that information into the overarching workflow is exceedingly important. So it's kind of to our point of all this, it's a plan out of one, how you're going to build that infrastructure, how you're going to take those steps, where are people going to charge? That's one of the biggest considerations. But once you kind of get there, there's also that next level of, okay, we're living with this day to day. We need to incorporate that information. So it goes beyond just the infrastructure itself. It's also thinking about, the people living with the vehicles and seeing that. So what we have seen is like, okay, if you have a circumstance where you can see, hey, this is how much a vehicle's charged. We know specifically how far this is going to go. It's available. It doesn't have to go to full charge right now. It's still available to for this particular day's work. And so knowing that from the beginning has been part of that overarching charging discussion that we've been having.
Yeah, and you hit it right on the nose, Ty. And actually, to even put it even more simply stated, there's a variety of charging infrastructure solution out there. Some more expensive, some without any bells and whistles. Very, very simple, straightforward charging. Especially for smaller fleet operators, sometimes that's all they need, and that's fine. So that's where, especially if you already have these telematic captures going on, it can help inform of maybe you don't need as robust a charging solution in that regard. I'll shout out on the public fleet side, City of Long Beach, California. They actually go with a very non-network charging solution, partly because they just really know their vehicles. But as they continue to expand and grow their charging, it lets them do it quicker and cheaper because they don't have to worry as much about that integration. But it's only because they've done the hard legwork to assess the routes, and they know level 2 charging actually a really great fit for that. So if there is that like 6 bullet here, and we can all, range anxiety is always real as we're thinking about these things, but even charging speed, you would think like, oh, we want to be sure we have DC fast charging, fastest charge possible, get it to 100% as much as possible. But you would be surprised on even step van operators or others. Level 2 sometimes is actually all they need, especially if they have that longer dwell time. So that's again where, as you're thinking about even just the cost of the charging equipment that you're purchasing, a way you can shave that off is going with lower speeds if you know that's going to be a good fit for that. Well, with that, I'll invite Chris to rejoin us, who will take us through roundtable discussion. We have a couple questions set up. If not mentioned at the top of it too, there's a question input as well, where we have a couple questions ready to go and a couple folks adding that in. But also, please feel free to add in questions set too, and we can be sure to get to that too. But Chris, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for this wealth of information. And certainly a lot of questions are arising, and we're getting a flow of questions in our chat. Let me just start with this one. We're talking about electrification and the type of routes, and generally repetitive routes, repetitive loads. In this person is talking about more co-located on heavy charging station routes. I would certainly repetitive routes and repetitive loads, but frankly, if you can charge in your depot or at home, that's probably the number one thing to do, right? Or what do you think on that, Matt?
Yeah, it definitely, thinking of it as regressing to the mean, like the most average vehicle is, and the one running with the most predictable routes, it's usually going to be a great candidate for electrification. If only, if only we know that route is going to fit, it's going to be a really great fit for maximizing the charge range. That's going to be a really great blessing there. One example I'll throw out to you is hospital logistic fleets, which you don't really think of them a lot, but there's so much logistics, especially in hospital operations that might have multiple campuses, where it's light duty vehicles often running Band-Aids, medical supplies, whatever, or whatever it's needed running around. A lot of great fit there, especially for the couriers that really are just driving a big circle there. And especially, we've had the chance to work with a lot of different hospital partners actually on looking at those EV sets. To the point, sometimes there's that one-off day you got to go to that really far off campus to do that really, that really dedicated run. So that too is where it's just really important to the data capture. Be sure you have as full a picture as possible. You can make informed decisions off of, we often work with a lot of telematic solution. If we can have, a 3-ish month window capture, that's great. But there are seasonal differences, right? Heat of summer, dead of winter, that when you're running AC or heating, or indeed changing up your routes, those fringe cases can change some of the calculus there, which again goes back to, if we need to do that, let's be sure we know where the on-route charging is, or other ways we can charge if we really need to think about that strategy as a backup. But Ty, I'll throw it to you too. How do you deal with the edge use case, or when you have to do that one odd job of a route?
I mean, the reality for those circumstances, to the point earlier, those the standard routes when you're doing similar things every day are the easiest, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the routes. It's somewhat about looking at just the total distance. So it can be, hey, if we're going to go in that farther route, would it be capable here, and looking for those other circumstances. And that's one reason that for us specifically, we do a lot with the mixed vehicle fleet. So it's a lot of like, hey, we have this specific use case for the specific electric vehicle, but you might have some other vehicles that you might be able to tap in for some of those fringe cases. And that goes into that overarching strategy, just being prepared. Now, in the long run, you want to be able to potentially use those electric vehicles on some of those fringe cases. And the reality, as more and more of the infrastructure gets out there, I think some of those concerns are starting to go away. At least that's what we've seen, because there's enough there where it's like you can be fairly confident. Yes, we can make it to that circumstance a little bit far and get back. And so it's just kind of, as that infrastructure gets built out more, people become more confident in it.
Yeah, really good points. Okay, we've got a flow of questions coming in here. Let me ask about this sustainability plan and kind of first steps, and really about creating that sustainability plan. I mean, it's tricky because you want to do it realistically, and you want to have it data-based, and you also want to inspire with what is possible. Hey, here's our baseline. We can get to X and do this by taking these steps. But can you give some advice? Is this about creating that first steps for a sustainability plan? Who wants to take that one first?
I'll stab first, Ty, and yeah, definitely throw it to you. Schedule the meeting. Honestly, like there's no, you don't have to have a slide deck. You don't have to have a memo. Just get that meeting on the books. That is how this, the best sustainability plans, or even just thinking of climate action at large, be it an organization, municipality, the partners that we have seen most successful, it's those that really recognize it's about building the relationship and also really getting to know who's that counterpoint and point contact within departments or those needed to cite that. But it always starts with a meeting. And I mean, I know it sounds super elementary, but there are sometimes those moments of like, well, like we're pulling something together that we'll send out to a group, and then maybe we get feedback over email. But just taking the time, hour-long meeting, take that time, sit down, just really talk it through. It can sometimes be helpful to have that executive sponsor or leader that really is showing the why and especially the vision to it, but then having those middle internal champions that would be the folks together. I know that's a very elementary advice, but it's one often overlooked of just getting that team together, recognizing that's the start, and then how do you continue to grow it?
Yeah, Matt, I actually couldn't agree more. I think, having, the people within your company that you're trying to that really can help strive and promote what you're trying to do. The step is really to understand what is that step? Like, what is your ultimate, what is the specific thing you're trying to do? You look at a lot of these things, it can get a little overwhelming, as we talked a little bit about earlier. So there is an incremental process here, and understanding, and from the beginning that process is incremental. Maybe not be all, hey, our goal is to do this all at once, but no, what's that first step? What's that small thing you can do right now? Who's that person you can find to be your champion in having something that's very recognizable as something that you as an individual, if you are passionate about this, that you can achieve? So that'd be always my first recommendation, is find that first achievable benchmark that you can set, that you can get to, because that will help you get to those other ones. And finding that individual champion to go in your organization is a key component and a great first benchmark of creating that first process.
Yeah, and I would add in too, to your point, finding those champions. It's finding those champions in each of the different departments that the fleet manager works in, right? I mean, it is absolutely essential that you've got buy-in from the top, or else it's like it just doesn't go anywhere. But finding that person in HR, finding that person in procurement, finding that person, in EHS. Those are going to really be the building blocks of really getting this together and getting that meeting together. And I guess to get buy-in, just a kind of a follow-up point there, to get buy-in, it's like you're going to have to take a data-driven approach to it. And that will, I think, motivate the teams. But how do we get there? I mean, is it as simple? I mean, simple. You've got your telematics data, but it's more than that. You've got to coalesce it. What are the first steps there to take the data different approach? And Ty, that's obvious. He teed up for you pretty well.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'm going to jump into it right here. So the reality is, like, and I can speak for VerizonConnect as well, we actually have tools built into our solution to help people start this process. So we actually have what we call the EV suitability tool, which you can use your telematics data right up front to say, hey, what are the vehicles that are in the best position to be electrified? So our specific tool, it provides, the top recommendations when looking at your entire fleet, mostly based upon distance, comparing an EV, a gas vehicle to an EV, and say within that standard EV, does the day-to-day operations of this particular vehicle meet the standard range for an EV? And so we can provide we give those top recommendations, but also it shows, okay, for each individual vehicle in the fleet that it deems is EV suitable, which ones are the best, or which ones it gives a recommendation for all of the vehicles. So, hey, if that one vehicle is coming towards its end of life, then you can say, hey, would this one be a good candidate as well? So we tried to make it really, really easy for customers to get that initial step when they're just kind of looking at their overarching fleets. And it also provides some of the background information of the fuel cost savings that you can expect by looking at your current vehicles, how far they're driving versus the electricity cost, as well as, when you want to have those sustainability goals, we also show how you can how much you can potentially reduce your CO2 emissions. So we have it incorporated, but, it's kind of standard now in telematics, is helping customers get started with that very early on.
Yeah. Matt?
Yeah, and I'll throw out, I mean, obviously we're really focused on the tool piece to it, which is, arguably the most critical piece. Some other things to help you on your way is really threefold. So one, seek out peers. While everyone really likes to think that their fleet operation is very unique, it's very specific, you don't understand, I got to get buy-in, and that we all struggle with this, as we think through those deployments. There's a lot of great groups and networks already existing, both on the public and private side. So it's a great way to go connect with peer fleet managers or really even sustainability teams at large who are also all grappling with this too. It's honestly a great way to also hear about the successes, the challenges, the ways to overcome from those peer colleagues. And they exist across the country, national level, state level, even at regional levels. There's I had the chance to attend a luncheon in Dayton, Ohio, where it's a sustainability luncheon that happens monthly. It was amazing, and it's just a lot of like-minded folks. So seeking out those colleagues, and just being sure to be tracking that. It doesn't have to be everyone electrified overnight and everything was perfect. So that's always a key piece. Second piece too, we're obviously really focused on the fleet data. There's a lot going on grants and other aspects, as you can imagine. So there's a lot of great resources out there. On the Electrification Coalition side, we have what we call the EV Funding Finder. It's designed as a basically choose your own adventure type of navigation tool where you say, I'm a private fleet looking at charging. It basically kind of give us your prescription, and then we will give you the sorted, here's all the grants and incentives that are up for grabs and currently open back to you, because there's a lot going on. So just to affirm that, but that's a really great way to be sure you're staying on top of that. And then third too, Electrification Coalition, we're always happy to connect with fleet partners and those that are really focusing on that. We really focus on tools and resources, but there are also other great organizations out there doing this work too. I have to give a shout out, as I'm alum of the program, but the Clean Cities and Communities program, a similar operation. It's a lot of state and metropolitan focused organizations working with fleet operators across all alternative fuels on a shared mission around reducing oil dependency. But likewise, it's just great to know who's in your backyard, who's a colleague or peer, and also being sure that you have access to, especially that grant funding news or other things as those are coming, to be sure you're well positioned to pursue and leverage all the analysis and planning that you've been doing.
Okay, great. And we've been touching on this, and it seems simple, but it's not. The first step fleets should take if they want to transition to EVs, it's a multi-pronged approach, but what may get left in the dark in the beginning, if you don't know, is contact your utility like yesterday. That has to be one of the first things you do. But anyway, who wants to take that one?
Utilities are always great to connect with. And actually, to even put it out there, I'll kind of give it like a dual answer, because recognizing it's a lot of different fleet partners tuning in is utility is always great. It really is the question of like, because the thing they're really looking for is, for the local distribution, do I need to be increasing transmission service here? If we have an upcoming rate case coming, do we need to think about funds that's requested there to support and deploy that? And the best news of all is sometimes they do actually have implementation funding or funding for vehicle replacement. And that's a really great way to be sure you're dialing into any utility-based programming in that regard too. If you're a private fleet operator, also be in touch with your local city or wherever that public government partner is. Above all else, they can be a great ally in this regard and really support the deployment. Be sure they're getting all the resources on any new permits or other key planning considerations that are needed. Be sure they're dialing that in for you. And also, too, it's a great way to be sure you're supporting your community and really thinking about how that messaging to that very early piece, when we're thinking about all these other ways we want to think of these sustainability plans for deployment, it's a really great way to think of how you're integrating and planning into the community and what benefit that can bring. On the public fleet side too, it's also that same thing, and actually this goes to both sides, is also thinking about any regional partners that can be involved in that. There's like councils of government, municipal planning organizations, county government, indeed, even maybe your state agencies. They're really eager for these stories because they are also equally focused on who's doing this action, where do we need to be thinking about putting that charging first. It's a simple hand raise and just like letting folks know what's going on, but it's really helpful. And again, I guess I keep coming back around to that, like peer exchange and also building that cohort, but it really has strong power in what we really see, not just individual organizations or entities, but how regions are able to advance together in a lot of that cohesive tapestry.
Yeah. What do you think, Ty? Gather the data too, right? I mean,
Yeah, I would say, looking at the data and also being introspective on your own business, because at the end of the day, you're going to know so much about what you do from a day-to-day basis. How many times do you tend to have those edge cases that we talked about before? Kind of looking through what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and just thinking about what is it you're trying to accomplish with that move to EVs. At the end of the day, I think it's great to also, as to Matt's point, reach out to others, because you don't have to be the expert on this right away before starting to make some of these decisions. That you can get bogged down as like, oh, I have to know more, have to know more, have to know more. There are a lot of people out there who already have this information who, like Matt said, are more than willing to help you along this process. Yeah. So what I would say is, understand your business, understand what you're trying to do, and think about some of those use cases, and then reach out to talk to people that you can really maybe have a little bit more experience. Look in your local region and say, okay, what can I do specifically here? There's a lot there, but some of those things are just kind of easy first steps that you can take along this process.
Yeah, and one thing I think which is overlooked too is the real money that utilities have in make-ready grants that can really help defray those initial costs, which is great. Hey, I get this one a lot. And we've got this shiny thing that's called electrification, and you can do other things to make an impact on sustainability. But what I think gets lost in that conversation is what really are those things you can do. That there's some that make it kind of a little impact and some that makes a bigger one. Hey, we're attacking idling. I'm going from a Camry to a Camry hybrid. I'm going from a step van down to a cargo van. But where do you guys think that the impact can really be felt not going EV?
So to your point, looking at some of the, I was going to jump in, looking at some of those looking at some of the things you were mentioning. So, I talked a lot about actually looking at the maintenance issues and making certain your vehicles are running properly. That's a core aspect of it, especially if you have recently purchased vehicles. There's been so many regulations about the manufacturing that does help contribute. And, looking at things like idling, like being able to say, hey, we're not necessarily going to just run our vehicle to have the air conditioner on as much. We'll look at some other things so that you might be able to make your employees, cooler in the hot summer months or in the freezing winter, as Matt mentioned before. But kind of just looking at all those different aspects, you can actually make a fairly significant impact just by making some of those small changes, and that compounds over time. Not everyone can take those big jumps right away, but just thinking about, hey, we want to take those incremental steps. And then those can also have the big business benefit as well. So one, it's the good for environmental aspects, but also, can be good for fuel cost savings, especially with idling and things like that. Lower maintenance when you're getting ahead of things, issues, and increased productivity because your vehicles aren't coming down. So it's kind of a win-win when you look at these circumstances of better business outcomes, better sustainability, better for all.
What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, well, actually, like right out of the gate, there's we were actually, when we were chatting and planning on this panel, there's an immediate benefit to the tailpipe emission, as in it gets eliminated, like quite literally. While there's emissions associated with the generation of the electricity elsewhere, which gratefully is overall still cleaner than diesel and gasoline across the entire U.S. Actually, when we look at the grid mix, but that taking that tailpipe emission right off of the road, that has a massive immediate benefit to the community. This is especially looking to neighborhoods that might be co-located with larger port operators or even larger fleet depot operations. On the flip side, I had the pleasure to host a panel that was focused on port operations last week, and the big thing, people do not think about how close they live to logistic operators and how close, not just maritime ports, but airports, rail ports, all this logistics that's moving and shaking. It is very present and very nearby. So being able to take that tailpipe emission, especially the particulate matter emissions, and a lot of this, the emission that sticks more local, that can really change block by block if you are near a highway versus in the suburb. That's an immediate benefit right there. Another benefit to this too, and actually to the maintenance piece that Ty's raising, we absolutely think more time on road is more money made, but this also creates great opportunity to think about how you can be better preparing the vehicle technicians that are working across all these vehicles, creating opportunity for maintenance technician and others. That's a really great way to actually create new training potential as well for a lot of that workforce development priority, which we also see really coming in. Put simply, it creates a really great career path as well for a lot of those community members, and also being sure then that you have the right staff and the right team to support. Should charger go down, should even just a simple tire rotation that's needed on the EV, or I also say as an EV owner, my windshield wiper fluid will run out sometimes, and you just never think about that because you're just never having to do oil changes or things like that. But it also gives you a chance to really think about how you're training your staff and those technicians to support it too, in a great way.
Yeah, hey team, before we close that out, I just want to mention that listeners, you can go to the VerizonConnect website and you can request a demo and talk to a rep at VerizonConnect about really how fleet management technology can support exactly what we're talking about, which is great. Hey, for the viewers that didn't get their questions answered, we'll email you those questions, the answers to those questions. And hey, thanks everyone. We're just about out of time. It was a great webinar, and thank you to Matt and Ty.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys. Great chat.